Hello, my name is Christopher Smith, and I very much appreciate the accommodation offered by the programming committee that lets me present this essay in video rather than face-to-face form. I wish I could be there with all of you. I also must begin with an acknowledgement. I submitted my abstract with its descriptor and title to the 2023 SAM Programming Committee prior to encountering a marvelous brief article by Melinda Russell in a 2018 edition of the journal Minnesota History, in which she employs exactly the same alliterative construction that I inadvertently copied, namely Dinkytown before Dylan. So a cautionary tale about searching the regional journals as well, and I will have a closing note about Dr. Russell at the end of my talk. Humbead's revised map of the world is a cartographic fantasy created by folk music fans Rick Shub and Earl Crabb, based upon an anecdote the two shared regarding an encounter in Berkeley in 1967, when Crabb advised a hitchhiker to create a sign saying New York, even though the traveler was already set with a ride as far as Kansas City. Quote, because New York is closer, that is, in terms of cultural and thus hitchhikers' proximity. He's right, Shub chimed in, catching some idea of where he was going with this. Maybe not geographically, but in most ways that actually affected us, New York was closer to Berkeley than Kansas City was. On the original version of the map, Cambridge, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco form the four quadrants of a fictional continent which recalls constructions of the pre-continental drift Pangaea. There are small frontier outposts of North Africa and Southeast Asia to indicate those locales' visibility on the folk hippie trail, while Cambridge and Berkeley occupy considerably greater cognitive real estate than Los Angeles or Boston. In subsequent editions, Shub lettered in literally hundreds of names, familiar and unfamiliar to folk fans and others, to fill in the unknown territories at the extremities of the world. The digital historian Michael J. Kramer identifies this map's cultural as well as comical insights, observing that, quote, Humbead's cartographically distorts Euclidean space and Mercator projection in order to suggest a more perceptually and culturally accurate mattering map, end quote. But what the map omits, which in fairness must be assessed in light of its substantial content of data and proportional interpretation, is the role of other smaller community music scenes elsewhere, which often served as feeders to the folk revival loci of Cambridge, Berkeley, and San Francisco. Repeatedly, nascent folk artists who had become influential in the 60s folk epicenters, out of which the revival emerged, originally came from small regional scenes, which served as interim up by their bootstraps stages. The singer-guitarist Spider John Koerner comments, yeah, well, like I say, that's the East Coast and West Coast, and we were kind of proud of saying we're not East Coast or West Coast, and we got our own, you know? And it was those places which were big deal places before all this stuff happened. And, you know, Dinkytown wasn't. Dinkytown was a funky little place at that time. It was smaller, but not dumber, end quote. A number of folk revival artists were born or raised in the college towns of the Northeast, but others came from more remote and exotic locales. Koerner from Rochester, New York, by way of San Diego and L.A., Judy Collins and Jimi Hendrix from Seattle, Odetta Holmes from Birmingham and then L.A., Phil Ochs from El Paso, and most famously or notoriously, Robert Zimmerman, born and raised in Hibbing, Minnesota, but who transmuted himself into Bob Dylan during his brief school career and developmental incubation in the Minneapolis college neighborhood of Dinkytown. In a comment that might be similarly ascribed to these other smaller feeder scenes, Dennis McNally said, quote, Dinkytown was full of bright minds that liked being close, but not too close, to a university, as they found themselves growing increasingly doubtful about mainstream American thought, politics, and culture. In Minneapolis, by the late 1950s, a cluster of stores, including bookshops, groceries, ice cream parlors, and the coffee shop called the 10 O'Clock Scholar, had shaped the Dinkytown neighborhood into a hotbed of student and artist-led activity, and it in turn became a zone for personal aspiration and transformation. But Dinkytown, and by analogy those other locations, had been scenes of bohemian, progressive, and experimental art making since the post-World War I period, as in other periods of political, social, cultural change, where Montmartre, the Latin Quarter, Greenwich Village, Stare Mesto, Chelsea, and Harlem. Though many of these locations were bohemian because of the confluence of experimental or alternative lifestyles and identities, and of progressive or experimental art, rather than of revived folkloric musics, a fact about which experimental photographer and co-founder of the New Law City Ramblers string band John Cohen has commented, the continuity was there nonetheless. In this presentation, based on a larger project on musical bohemias as intentional communities and drawing upon period archives, urban geography, and a taxonomy of musical exchange, I explore the sociocultural dynamics of early Dinkytown and analogous feeder arts communities elsewhere in the U.S. as one building block for the 20th century Anglo-American phenomenon of folk revival. An earlier forerunner and likely inspiration of Humbead's map is the Map of Bohemia by the Bay Area artist and literateur Gelett Burgess, published in his magazine The Lark, which identifies places like the Sea of Dreams, Philistia, the Great Philistine Desert, Pays de la Jeunesse, Veritas, the Port of Peace, Bohemia, Arden, the Hills of Fame, Vagabondia, Seavitia, Terra Incognita, Licentia, and the Sea of Care. While these are fictional places, the archness of their naming versus the comparatively real provinces of Humbead's San Francisco, Berkeley, Cambridge, and New York City, with more modestly sized and influential sites like Los Angeles and Boston, and the distant island of Nashville, and the even more distant small continent of rest of the world, do capture a sense of Bohemian places' experiential and cognitive proximity, and the comparative consonance of both Burgess's and Humbead's vision. Quote, "To take the world as one finds it, the bad with the good, making the best of the present moment, to spend freely when one has money, and to hope gaily when one has none. This is the temper and spirit of the modern Bohemian in his outward and visible aspect. If in some noble natures it rises to a bold simplicity and naturalness, it may also lend its butterfly precepts to some very pretty vices and lovable faults. For in Bohemia one may find almost every sin save that of hypocrisy. What then is it that makes this mystical empire of Bohemia unique, and what is the charm of its mental fairyland? It is this: there are no roads in all Bohemia. One must choose and find one's own path, be one's own self, live one's own life." End quote. According to Michael Kramer, the digital history specialist who's written about Humbead's as a kind of pre-digital wiki of mapped and interlinked knowledge, quote, "If there were some ways of tracking stats on a printed poster like there is for a webpage, I'm sure it would rank high on the list of total viewing time logged, because it would hold your eye for an unspecified time and hold up to repeated viewing." End quote. In addition to the model proposed by Burgess, a member of the Bay Area's 1890s literary renaissance and, parenthetically, originator of the verb to blurb, Kramer adds in the possible additional models for Humbead's of Dorothea Dix Lawrence's 1945 folklore music map of the United States, very possibly familiar due to its publication date to members of the revival, and the rather less likely and more recent parallel of Alan Lomax's Global Jukebox project. The locution Bohemian, to identify outlier communities and identities, originates in erroneous presumptions about the supposed Bohemian origin of Romany people. The term came to be associated with artists and journalists in the first part of the 19th century in both France and the USA, ascribing neighborhoods like the Latin Quarter of Paris and the immigrant neighborhoods of New York with these characteristics. By the U.S. Civil War, journalists who had gathered at Manhattan's Pfaff's Cellars German beer garden were self-ascribing the word. And around that same time, both Bret Hart and Mark Twain layered on Northern California associations. By the first decade of the new century, locations like Greenwich Village and Provincetown were attracting mobile communities of self-described artists and creatives. Now, Minneapolis-St. Paul was another of those towns that dotted the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Ohio, among other rivers, in which commerce, exploration, and immigration combined to yield a yeasty, rich local musical culture. Riverboat musicians who plied their trade out of New Orleans and Memphis made the Twin Cities part of a circuit that also included Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. And thus the cities felt the impact of the interwar Great Migration, especially in the clubs of South Minneapolis along 4th and Nicollet Avenues. For example, the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, the second of the great NOLA jazz bands to be recorded and widely distributed, played those clubs, while the proximity of the Canadian border and Canadian distillates during Prohibition led to a similar confluence of organized crime money, the alcohol, sex, music, entertainment, triumvirate, and complex patterns of racial segregation and exchange. As was common in other cities in which such patterns yielded new music, white consumption of black entertainment in black and tan clubs, and the impact of World War II social disruptions led to new idioms, new venues, and new opportunities for musicians, both black and white. In passing, we might note that Hennepin Avenue hero Prince Rogers Nelson's people were part of that same migration and reorientation. His father, John Nelson, born in Louisiana in 1916 and part of an extended multi-generational family of musicians, moved to Minneapolis in 1948 and worked throughout the Twin Cities as a jazz pianist and singer. Like most of the other loci and outliers on Humbead's map, including most particularly Cambridge and Berkeley, the presence of the University of Minnesota campus on the east bank of the river brought many other jazz musicians to town to gig and live, and established an ongoing presence for participatory music of various kinds amongst students. In the 30s and 40s, that music was swing, but in the post-World War II years, and in parallel with other oppositional art and experience-based movements, especially in literature and the visual arts, other genres attracted young revivalists' attention in dance and music. Dinkytown appears to have become the thing itself that the folkies knew in the period immediately after the Second War. For example, the first official use of the terminology comes with the 1948 formation of the Dinkytown Business Association. Situated within the Marcy Holmes neighborhood of Minneapolis, the neighborhood also forms the north side of the university's East Bank campus. As analogous proximity would do in Berkeley and Lower Manhattan, Cambridge and Ann Arbor, that university proximity is crucial because it was the influx of college students from around the Midwest and points beyond into the neighborhood in the 1950s that led to a growth of a small outpost of that Bohemia captured on Humbead's map. And Dinkytown eventually formed the launchpad for Bob Dylan's reinvention of himself, from a Buddy Holly imitating rock and roller to a Jack Elliott and Woody Guthrie cloning self-mythologizer. Melinda Russell's excellent essay, Dinkytown Before Dylan, which predated my own unintended borrowing of her alliterative title, lays out the role of certain key individuals in the burgeoning folk music energy of the neighborhood, particularly Gene Bluestein, a New York-born grad student and Pete Seeger devotee. Having arrived in 1950 to attend the university's nascent American Studies program, Bluestein himself was a catalytic individual. He played a variety of folk instruments, he created educational programming for schools and local media, and he produced 3 record albums for Smithsonian Folkways. But the groundwork for his spark plug energy as player, educator, radio and concert programmer, and regional folk song collector had already been anticipated in the late 1940s by the creation of the Folk Arts Foundation of America and then the Folk Dance Federation of Minnesota, which keyed into the post-World War II explosion of interest in vernacular and square dance and the costumed reverent genre that came to be called international folk dance. Harry Weber, then a PhD candidate in Latin literature at the university, had a nuanced explanation. Quote, "When I arrived in Minneapolis in 1955 with a guitar, folk music was very much underground. The older people came from the old left. Their idea of folk music was a union song, Pete Seeger, and the People's Songbook." Additional substantive and insightful commentary comes from the sociologist Ryan Moore, who successfully links the Adorno-esque jargon of authenticity, Jane Jacobs's Death and Life of Great American Cities, and early 60s US-UK folk and skiffle activism against nuclear proliferation. Moore's pithy formulation recognizes, quote, "the creative ceiling imposed by the folk's formal traditionalism and the left's demand for social realism," end quote. There were thus Dinkytowns, little university-based bohemias all over North America in the early 1960s. As the map makes clear, the actual population of any of these communities was quite small, but they were connected in a pre-digital communicative internet composed of postcards, phone calls, mimeographed newsletters, and seat-of-the-pants touring by car and Greyhound bus. There had been something of an intersection and overlap between the Beats and San Francisco poets of the early 50s and late 40s, and the later 50s folk revivalists, not least because those later revivalists had avidly composed and consumed tomes analogous to On the Road and Howl. But the groups were distinctly different in terms of orientation, experience, and not infrequently economic class. Amongst the earlier poets, for example, both Gary Snyder in California and Jack Kerouac in the Northeast came from working class stock. But, like Beats William S. Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg, many of the later folk revivalists came from more educated classes with a higher likelihood of college experience. Also, in passing, few had served, unlike Ginsberg and Snyder, during time of war. They were just young enough to qualify as post-war babies. Another veteran, Koerner, said, quote, "There was a whole bunch of us who were all kind of emotionally adrift in that time," end quote. So in 1958, the 10 O'Clock Scholar Coffee House opened on 14th Avenue between 4th and 5th Streets, though the Scholar did experience quite a peripatetic existence over the course of its life. Howard Soanes' description provides an evocative description of its physical and experiential specifics, which could also stand in for roughly contemporaneous shops elsewhere, like Tulla's Coffee Grinder and the Club Mount Auburn 47 in Cambridge, the Turk's Head and the Café Yana in Boston, and the earlier Café Trieste, Hungry Eye, and Six Gallery in San Francisco. Quote, "At the time, places like the Scholar were springing up all across the country. An old store with a regular storefront window had been cleared to create a long room furnished with wooden stools, tables, and benches. At the back was a coffee bar. Students could hang out all day at the Scholar, nursing cups of coffee or tea, smoking, playing chess, reading, or listening to musician friends who got up to perform on the tiny stage at the front window. To Dylan, Dinkytown seemed a magical place. As he once said, every day there was like Sunday. Spider John Koerner, born in 1938, came from Rochester, New York, and had served briefly in the Marines stationed in San Diego, before ending up almost by happenstance in the late summer of '59 as an aeronautical engineering student at the University of Minnesota. It was there that he hooked up with equally young blues aspirants Dave Ray and Tony Glover, landing up in Minneapolis after his first lengthy cross-country trips. Quote, I'd started hanging out with this guy, and one day I just quit school, took money I had, we got in this car, we drove to Florida, through New Orleans, over to Los Angeles. This was the first time I was out on my own, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I kind of got lost at it, and I joined the United States Marine Corps, something I still marvel at that I ever did. End quote. Dylan himself arrived at the university in the fall of '59, lived briefly in a Jewish fraternity house, and actually left before the start of the next academic year, heading for New York, where he would continue to develop all manner of alternate autobiographies, trying on new songs, new styles, and new personae. Koerner, however, comments upon the paradoxical empowerment that the smaller regional scenes provided, and which led him and other denizens of Dinkytown and parallel bohemias elsewhere into modest but worldwide and lifelong careers in roots music. Quote, one thing I think that happened when we were out in Minnesota was, I still believe in this process, in a sense, we were just enthusiastic. We had no idea what you were supposed to be doing with this material, so we just got into it and went right ahead with it, without knowing what anybody else outside our own immediate area thought about it. We were really insular. We didn't know much about what was going on in the East Coast at that point, so I think when we came on the larger folk scene, we really surprised some people just because we weren't like the others. So to return to Humbeads and reflections upon regional revivalisms. The smaller feeder scenes, those internal islands that sent their offspring voyaging outward toward college, coastal, and central folk revival scenes, were everywhere. Dinkytown is only one example. Very often, these scenes served as interim stages wherein mostly young people from smaller towns could begin to experience at a formative stage the concept of an intentional community of individuals who were more or less consciously choosing alternatives to the life paths they perceived to be on offer. And in most cases, the story of their external and internal journeys was more complex than the often oversimplified accounts of urban college kids meet regional tradition bearers the tales of the folk revival typically tell. There are additional stories to be had here. For example, amongst that cluster of individuals who often became elders or mentors to younger players in the scene and who'd served in the armed forces, like Koerner and Eric von Schmidt and Dave Van Ronk. But those reflections are beyond the scope of this paper and my time and must await that larger project. What we can say here and now is that Bohemias have always been with us, or at least they have been with us for as long in the Anglo-Euro-American sphere as young people bored with their natal environments have sought other kinds of community, united around making art out of lived experience in places away from home and in company with others who share their inchoate dreams. The painters of Montmartre might have drunk vermouth rather than coffee, and the university students at Notre Dame de Paris shared wine and Latin rather than marijuana and English. But both those groups, across continents and a span of 900 years, might have recognized the expanded sense of life possibilities that an intentional community of artists might bring. And so a coda, to return to Melinda Russell's wonderful article, Dinkytown Before Dylan. As I said at the outset, I found her Minnesota history essay just a few weeks ago, and only a few days ago I went out to try to find contact info for Dr. Russell, so I could both thank her and apologize for the inadvertent lifting of her alliterative title. And I discovered that, in fact, we had lost her on February 24th. As I wrote on the Carleton College web page dedicated to her memory, I never met Melinda, and I am the poorer for that. I recently encountered her scholarship for the first time in a Minnesota history article on folk revival in Dinkytown. I will be giving a video presentation for the Society for American Music meetings in the Twin Cities, and that lecture will be dedicated with sorrow and with gratitude to her memory and to her teachings that community lasts. 9 bows.